Hello, everybody. I'm here with Nicholas Buxton, Reverend Dr. Nicholas Buxton. Hi, Nicholas.
Hi.
Thanks for being on the podcast today. Nicholas is a priest and he's a scholar. He's the founder of Just Meditation, which is a meditation center in Newcastle. He's a really cool guy. He's done all sorts of things, and I can't wait to get into your life story a little bit.
Okay.
He's got a PhD from Cambridge in Buddhist philosophy, and I think you're just a great person to talk to about contemplative practice from another tradition, from outside of the yoga tradition, which is where this podcast is usually focused on. Let's just start with a little bit of your life story.
hmm
You have a PhD in Buddhist philosophy. How does someone who studied Buddhist philosophy for so many years become a priest?
I suspect we can count the number of Church of England clergy with PhDs in Buddhism on the fingers of one finger. But but that's not to say there aren't colleagues who are very interested in Buddhism actually. And there's been um, a very kind of healthy dialogue over the years between Buddhist and Christian spirituality. If you think of people like Thomas Merton, was a Christian monk, but who engaged very deeply with the Buddhist tradition as well. And when you get beyond the obvious differences, a deeper consistency, I would say, in the kind of contemplative and meditation traditions of both traditions, which makes very fruitful ground for studies of comparative mysticism and so on and so forth. But in terms of parish priests in the Church of England, I suspect there's not very many who have studied Buddhism at that kind of academic level that I have. But there's certainly a lot who would be very interested in the kind of spirituality and the meditation. There's quite a lot of there'll be quite a lot of people. There'll be quite a lot of Christians who are interested in Buddhism, particularly when getting into the territory of meditation and contemplative practice and the teachings of Buddhism around that, and still maintaining their Christian identity. There's quite a lot who would come into that category, but perhaps not that many who will have kind of studied it in the formal way that I happen to have done. But I mean, I came into doing what I'm doing now, as in being a priest, by probably quite an unusual route, in that I had the interest in the Eastern traditions, Buddhism, and also yoga and Hinduism, and I traveled quite a lot, lived in an ashram in India for a while, and all of that was before I even started going to church. So I had all that kind of with me, that was part of me. And then I felt the need to explore the Christian and Western tradition as well. But I
And
had all
what
that kind of with me when I went in, you see.
what happened that you felt you wanted to make the shift from Eastern spirituality to Christianity?
I suppose it was a recognition of the cultural dimension of a religious tradition. It's not just a set of abstract beliefs and propositions and theories and so on and so forth. It's also part of a cultural identity that shapes us and shapes the society in which we live. And I found among Western converts to Buddhism, of whom there are a great deal, that there, to me, and it was just my perception, but there seemed to me, in some cases, an element of conflict between the person they had been before they became a Buddhist. And by converts, I'm talking about people who actually became monks and nuns, not just people kind of like I was, interested in Buddhism, but people who actually went kind of whole hog and became ordained into a lineage in Thailand or Tibet or wherever. And in some cases, I just felt there was this kind of conflict between who they had been and who and what they were becoming or trying to be. And I thought, well, why is that, and what's all that about, and why? And in many cases, it was quite explicit. It took the form of a very sort of hostile attitude towards Christianity, particularly those who'd grown up Catholic, and this kind of hostility and slightly naive characterization, this sort of straw man version of Christianity. I can't possibly believe in an old man sitting in the clouds and judging us and so on and so forth. Well, no, Christian who's reflected on theology and the tradition would think that. So it just seemed there was this conflict, this tension, and I thought, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be, in that kind of sort of almost schizophrenic position of trying to reconcile these two identities or whatever. And so I felt, well, I'll kind of, when I go back to England, this all happened overseas. I thought, well, when I go back to England, I will take the advice that you sometimes get from people like the Dalai Lama and other Buddhist teachers who say, look, it's great that you've learned all this stuff about Buddhism and you've practiced and you've joined the monastery or whatever. But when you go back to your own culture, don't try and be a good Buddhist, try and be a good Christian, or words to that effect. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll try that. Mm-hmm. I'll try that. So that's what I did. Took a while, I have to say. Took a while because when I started going to church as an adult, I thought it was awful. Hated it. Mm-hmm. It was just so far removed from the kind of spirituality that I had been engaging with. And I don't just mean in terms of it being Buddhist versus Christian or Hindu versus Christian. I mean just in terms of the whole vibe, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Was just, yeah.
So, I mean, it's very common that people who are going through some sort of spiritual awakening mm-hmm. turn to Eastern traditions because yes, they're so sort of like explicit in
yes.
in their in the teaching and the method and the
yes,
and it's not. I mean, this is just from what I've gathered, but it's not so explicit in the Christian tradition. It's not so available.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's an enormous part of the I was going to say problem, it's not a problem so much, but it's an enormous part of the story, as it were. In the Christian tradition, the sort of the spiritual dimension, the contemplative dimension, it's there, but you have to go looking for it. And it may not be kind of what you expect. Whereas certainly in Buddhism and really in the Western engagement with Buddhism and the Western engagement with Indian and Eastern traditions, that much more explicit focus on meditation and spiritual practice and technique and so on and so forth is really in the foreground. I think one would have to qualify that, though, by saying, if you go to Thailand, if you go to Sri Lanka, if you go to some of these places, talk to people who would 100% identify, yes, I am a Buddhist, I'm a practicing Buddhist, and then try and talk to them about, meditation and the Satipatthana Sutra and dependent origination. They wouldn't know what you're talking about.
Right.
So there is a kind of thing about how the West has engaged with Eastern traditions and really zoned in on certain aspects and very often excluded other aspects. That is, that's also part of the story. But, to go back to your original point, yes, absolutely. The sort of teaching and the practice is very much explicit, particularly in Buddhism, but also in other Eastern traditions, and very much more hidden in the Christian tradition. And we'll even say, within the Christian tradition, it's the best kept secret of the tradition. And generally people in the pews in churches, your average practicing Christian, wouldn't necessarily, kind of be very much involved in thinking about these kind of things or very aware of those kind of traditions and practices. But then the same is true, and this was my sort of sub point, the same is true of your average practicing Buddhist in your kind of, Asian Buddhist country. They, might not be so aware of those aspects of their own tradition either. So it's kind of the same in a way. It's just that we, in our engagement with Eastern traditions, going back to the kind of scholars of the 19th century and so on and so forth, they just focused in on certain aspects. And within Buddhism, if you look at the history, there was a kind of reform movement within Buddhism in the 19th century in places like Burma and Sri Lanka to really say, yeah, the most important thing about Buddhism is meditation. I mean, I'm oversimplifying. Yeah. And, we'll do away with some of these other cultural elements and, quote unquote superstitious elements. And that was all part of the engagement with the West. So it's quite a complex and fascinating story as to how it is that we now make certain assumptions that Buddhism is all about meditation and so on and so forth. Yeah. You go to Sri Lanka, you go to a temple in Sri Lanka. It's not all about meditation. It's about people smashing coconuts on statues of Ganesh and saying prayers for health and happiness and so on and so forth. They're not meditating on dependent origination or the absence of selfhood.
Yes,
but they're engaging in cultural religious practices like everyone else. And so it's just, you got to kind of nuance the story a little bit, but it's absolutely fascinating. But generally speaking, yes, I would agree totally. The hiddenness of the contemplative tradition in Christianity is definitely a factor, and the much more explicit, foregrounding of meditation in Eastern traditions. Yeah, it's there. Why it's there is interesting, but yeah, it's there.
Mm-hmm. So when you started training to become a priest, what was that like, and where did you find, or what did you find were the contemplative practices?
Okay, so by then we're jumping 10 years. So I got into all this sort of meditation and stuff through Eastern traditions. And then 10 years later, I found myself training for the priesthood, and there was a sort of process behind all that. So by then I was already aware of and interested in the Christian mystical tradition.
Didn't you also spend time in a monastery as a monk before then?
Not as a monk, but I spent quite a lot of time in quite a few monasteries as a guest. Was very seriously exploring the possibility of a vocation to monastic life, to the religious life. I had spent some time in a Buddhist monastery, lived in a Buddhist monastery for 6 months, and was very much into that as a way of being, as a way of life. And when I came back to England, I was looking to continue on that path of being involved in communities, living that life. But I was a little bit wary of actually kind of signing up and becoming a monk. That was a step I was finding difficult to really contemplate. But I did explore it, and I explored it very seriously, and I engaged with a number of Christian communities as well. And then, over this process, this kind of 10-year process, that's when I went back to university as a mature student. That's when I did my studies, my graduate studies in Buddhism, so on and so forth, and was also continuing to explore the questions of vocation and what that might look like, how I could, find a way of being in the world that was fulfilling the kind of spiritual callings I had. And that's what ended up as, what I'm doing now, minister in the Church of England. Mm-hmm. But by the time I was training, and this is 10 years ago now, so we're talking about a 20-year sort of trajectory, I was already into the Desert Fathers and the teachings of some of the early monastic tradition and so on and so forth. And in fact, as part of my studies, then having completed my PhD in Buddhism, I was then writing my master's thesis on the Desert Fathers and the Evagrius and all that kind of stuff.